In this week's episode of Bleach the Thousand Year Blood War, Yhwach brutally kills the head captain Yamamoto, the Sternritter summon the Soldat to devastate the Soul Society, and Ichigo finally arrives to duel the Quincy King. But is he too late to make a difference? And so, with the end of episode 7, Born in the Dark, comes a solemn end to the first Quincy invasion. And I have to be honest, I've been routinely and thoroughly impressed with how they have handled the start of the Thousand Year Blood War arc so far. As I've said in the past, this is a difficult portion of the story to get right. It's fast-paced, it's chaotic, it is desperate, and they really have to do their all to accurately convey that while also nailing those truly crucial and emotional set pieces. Byakuya's near-death defeat, Yamamoto's actual death, all of these moments had to be done perfectly. And truth be told, I was a little concerned around episode 3 that the pacing was just too much, that they were going to blast through all of these vital moments in the blink of an eye. But having gotten to this point now with episode 7 behind us and the first invasion wrapped up, I am really happy with what we've been given, and I have to say that at least the last 2 or 3 episodes have really felt about as close to perfect as they could have possibly been. And the same goes as well for this most recent episode, which I am both very happy with and very excited to talk about. And so, as we always do with our in-depth spoiler review and discussions, we'll be taking a look at this episode through the perspective of somebody who has read the entirety of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, so there will be full spoilers for the arc to follow as we take a look at this episode to see what they added, what they changed, and yes, even what they took away. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I just want to give everyone supporting me over there on Patreon an enormous shout out and a huge thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. So yeah, if you can't tell already, if you couldn't tell with my live reaction to the episode, I was very happy once again with this one. I think they knocked it out of the park, and this episode in particular, I think had some really challenging material, some of the most emotional moments that Bleach has ever had. Kubo was on a roll at this point in the source material, hitting us in the gut over and over with these really just dark and depressing moments, but wonderful character moments as well, and I think for the most part the anime managed to get them right. Of course, you've got Yamamoto's heart-wrenching death, the responses from characters like Kyoraku that really tug on the heartstrings. You've got Byakuya's devastatingly beautiful conversation with Ichigo when it really looks like he's about to pass away and passes the mantle of the Protector of Soul Society officially over to the boy he once saw as nothing more than a Ryoka intruder. All of this had to be done perfectly, and you guys know me, I've mentioned this in the past, particularly that scene with Byakuya is one of my favourite, not just in the arc, but in the entirety of Bleach. But before we talk about any of that, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because as always with our spoiler review and discussions, we need to first look at what this episode covered. And this episode actually covered a little less than previous episodes, and in my opinion, I think it found the absolute sweet spot for the amount of chapters to adapt. In a way, this episode actually felt a little shorter than others because of it, but I really think by adapting only 4 chapters this time, they were able to give those all-important moments the room to breathe that they deserved, while being able to expand on other moments that I absolutely wasn't anticipating, making for, in my opinion, perhaps the best paced episode of the Thousand Year Blood War so far. And that, I think, is the critical component of its success. So in terms of the chapters that we are looking at here, this episode covered chapter 511, Die Standing, 512, The Stand Ablaze, 513, The Dark Moon Stroke, and finally 514, Born in the Dark, of course, the title of this week's episode. But, oh boy, was this episode a real treat for those of us who have been absolutely dying for more contextual lore around the 1,000-Year Blood War. Those of us who have been dying for more historical context for this arc in general. A little while ago, before the anime released, I did a video looking at the 13 things, I think it was, that I wanted to see changed in the anime the most. And my number one pick on that list was to actually see the battle between Yamamoto and Yhwach from 1,000 years ago. It's the very namesake of this arc, and in the original manga, in the source material, we never saw it. It was only alluded to in the briefest of ways. And I always thought, for as much as I loved this arc, that was a cardinal storytelling sin, because it gave us basically zero context for anything surrounding the relationship between Yamamoto and Yhwach, how Yhwach survived to reappear again in the present day. Everything like that was totally missing. And so to see this episode open with a semi-black and white rendition of that battle 1,000 years ago, with Yhwach's invasion into Soul Society, his attempt to conquer Soul Society, only to be met by the bloodthirsty savages that are the original Gotei 13, was basically a dream come true. Yhwach marches forwards with rows of his men as explosions go off across the Seirete. This orchestra blares behind them as we get a close-up of Yhwach's smug grin. This is everything I pretty much ever wanted. They are, of course, met within the flames of war by the original Gotei 13, who up until this point in the canon manga we had never seen outside of a single panel that showed them as nothing more than silhouettes. And I mean, this is everything I wanted, everything I dared to hope for. I said in the review of last week's episode, before even that Gotei 13 image had come out, that I was hoping we might get a snippet of these characters, and I can only imagine what my reaction would have been had that image of the Gotei 13 not been released early. But it's just a wonderful set piece that, in my opinion, adds so much to the lore surrounding this battle 1,000 years ago. Of course, the first person to leap into the fray is the demon herself, Unohana, with this almost deadpan blank look on her face as she splits a Quincy in half. The massive captain comes crashing forwards, grabs an unfortunate Quincy soldier by the face and mashes his head into another soldier's head. It is so brutal as well. Again, that uncensored nature really lending itself to showing us the cruelty of this battle in the past. The purple-haired girl with the eye patch leaps forward with a crazed expression on her face. The captain, who I still believe might be a Shiba, comes across slicing a Quincy in two. Another captain, the one who reminds me of Lisa and Nanao, takes off a Quincy's arm before splitting him almost in two from the head downwards. Again, it's just so gory and it's so awesome seeing these captains defending their home in this way. One of the captains slices a Quincy's throat while the potential Shihoin ancestor kicks a Quincy's head off with some pretty expert-looking hand-to-hand combat. The mysterious monochrome captain stands surrounded by nothing but a pool of blood and decapitated soldiers, while that strange, toothy, bald captain crushes a Quincy with his club-like weapon. At the same time, this elderly captain is seen driving his blade into a helpless Quincy on the floor, while we see the last two captains, the one who looks a bit like a Kuchiki and the other one who is that evil, sinister-looking captain, each having close-ups as they kill more of the enemy soldiers. Forgive me if I'm too excited about this, but this, I cannot emphasize enough, is exactly the sort of thing we should have seen in the original chapter. It is dark, it is brutal, it is harrowing as the bodies pile up, and eventually they are all fighting atop a mound of corpses, both Tangled, Shinigami, and Quincy. It is a desolate sight to behold. As for the head captain himself, Yamamoto, without an inch of expression on his face, is just incinerating Quincy to the bone. We see Argola and Hubert being killed. We see the true horror on Zedritz's face as his life escapes him. It is seriously crazy to see. Yhwach himself appears to be injured, clasping his arm as he is now surrounded by all of these original captains. Yamamoto wades across the bodies with complete disdain and contempt for those that he is stepping on as he approaches the Quincy King. Activating the ancient version of his bankai, we see his sword is ablaze, his body aflame, as it appears he's about ready to take on Yhwach himself. As Yhwach flings his cape aside, he seems about ready to continue to challenge Yamamoto, a massive grin on his face, but then we get perhaps the most surprising moment of this whole flashback, and my favourite moment of all. Rising up behind Yhwach from underneath this mound of corpses is none other than Chojuro Sasakibe, who drives Gonryumaru through Yhwach's back, bursting out of the Quincy's chest. Yhwach looking utterly horrified, Chojuro looking utterly enraged, giving Yamamoto that opening he needs to bring his burning blade down upon Yhwach himself. In my opinion, this is probably supposed to signal the end of the fight. I have to say, I can't get enough of the way the anime keeps inserting Sasakibe into the past like this. It makes sense that he would be there, but I love that he is there from such a personal perspective, and it actually adds even more to the canon material. Now it feels like Yhwach purposefully targeted Sasakibe at the start of this battle as some form of vengeance for what happens 1,000 years ago. It does still leave me with some questions. For instance, how does Yhwach go from this moment to being the nearly powerless, sleeping giant that we know he ends up being as he waits for the Kaiser Gesang to come true, for that prophecy to be told that allows him to regain his intelligence, his power, his heartbeat, etc. How does he go from this moment to that moment? Regardless, I think this is pretty much the perfect way they could have started this episode. It is so very exciting to see. I do still wonder if Kubo really did create all of these new captains just for this, or if there is any chance we'll see them again at some point in the future. Regardless, I do love it, and it adds so much. But after that frankly shocking and fantastic introduction, the episode starts out pretty much as I expected it to, with the opening to chapter 511. This scene plays out very similarly to the original chapter, except they remove Kyoraku's initial line about asking Yamamoto what this is on the wall, and they also remove Kyoraku's line about whether or not it depicts some kind of fire god from legend. But on the flip side, there is a nice new line here where Kyoraku is kind of catching his breath and he calls Yamamoto a damn old geezer, and I really like that because it shows that even back here, nearly about 1,000 years ago or so, when Yamamoto was perhaps still renowned for being this heartless monster, the young Kyoraku could still get away with calling him names, with being insubordinate, and I love getting to see that extension of their relationship. Yamamoto's line about the monster that appeared in Soul Society is all the same as it is in the original chapter, but it is interesting to think about the timeline here. Going back to this idea of when is this scene set? It can't be 1,000 years ago exactly, because this is clearly after that battle with Yhwach, and Yamamoto here seems to at least realise the error of his ways, seems to at least have begun to have that new mindset where violence isn't everything, where he can live without violence and can enjoy peace instead. This does seem to be perhaps the earliest days of that new, weak Yamamoto, at least in Yhwach's eyes. Now, last week they took the image of Yamamoto's face from 511 and stuck it at the end of 510, just before he is about to be slashed, and I mentioned in my review that I wasn't sure how necessary that was, and if it actually took away from this moment in 511, because that's such a good shot of Yamamoto's face just before he is actually cleaved in two. But I said that it wouldn't matter so much if they included some rendition of that here as well, and that is exactly what they do. Unlike last episode, they don't don't use an exact version of this image, but we do still get that shot of Yamamoto's face, that sad look in his eyes. Suddenly blood bursts from his lips, and we get that absolutely crazy visual where the top half of his body just slips and slides and falls off of the bottom half. It is so difficult to watch him actually fall apart like that. It feels even more hard-hitting than it was in the original chapter. Toshiro and Soifon get these brand new reactions to Yamamoto being mortally wounded, while Kyoraku and Ukitake's are the same from the chapter. Kyoraku realizing what's happened and spinning around to try and reach Yamamoto, crying out for his father figure only to be blasted mercilessly by Robert, is a brilliant scene in the manga, and it's captured and handled very well here too. I love that it truly amplifies the cold and opportunistic nature of the Sternritter, but also shows Kyoraku's emotions getting the better of him. This is clearly the worst case scenario, where even a captain as usually chill and experienced as Kyoraku is completely losing it in the middle of a do-or-die situation. It's actually a scene very similar to Rukia's earlier on in the first invasion, when she senses the defeat of Byakuya and tries to flee from Menina. So where I chastised Rukia for that before, I feel like I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't also call out Kyoraku for that too, but it really is a very powerful moment, and it's easily understandable why he would turn his back on Robert in that brief split second. And it's actually harder hitting than Rukia's scene, because we know that Yamamoto is actually about to meet his end. This scene is over in a flash in the original chapter, and I feel like here you get to experience it a little bit more. You get to see that raw emotion on Kyoraku's face, and you get to really feel those gunshots slamming into his body. I love the way we get his black silhouette on that blood-red background. It feels like something of a callback to the original anime. That's how they used to censor violent moments, whereas here it's just being used to amplify an already unbelievable scene. This next scene featuring Yhwach as he kind of stands over the defeated Yamamoto is very similar to how it appears in the original chapter. I've always been kind of surprised that after waiting 1,000 years to finally get his revenge on Yamamoto, that Yhwach seemed content to just walk away after a single slash, not even really bothering to confirm whether or not Yamamoto had actually died. Yamamoto, even in this helpless state, of course, reaches out to grab Yhwach's cloak, and in the anime there's a slight extension here where we get an extra shot of Yhwach looking down, kind of gazing down at Yamamoto, almost in pity it seems, or even perhaps disgust seems more likely, before just cleanly slicing off his arm. In the manga, that slice happens instantly. There's no room for emotion here. Now, this next part could just be a translation issue, but the line about Yamamoto being a war potential is slightly different here in the anime to how it is in the original chapter. In the original chapter, Yhwach claims to have never had Yamamoto as one of the 5 war potentials, whereas here in the anime, Yhwach asks Yamamoto if he knows why he was removed from that list of war potentials. And as all of this is going on, there is a fantastic new shot of Yhwach just towering over Yamamoto, looking completely triumphant with his boot on Yamamoto's head. I'm very pleased that they kept the entirety of Yhwach's speech here intact. It's a powerful but also interesting moment that really gives us fresh insight into this warlord's mind. Someone who hasn't really been able to move on from that battle 1,000 years ago. This is everything Yhwach has been living for, to rise up once again and challenge the Gotei 13 that once defeated him, but now all he sees is a pathetic group of weaklings who have grown old, who have grown complacent, and perhaps crucially, who have grown kind. And in Yhwach's eyes, as a man who still heralds from that old time, as a man who effectively hasn't been allowed to change, he sees that as disgraceful. It is a great moment. It feels like a moment that puts a cap on that original Gotei 13 once and for all. Of course, that's not quite the case, because Unohana will have a spotlight moment later on, but it feels like with Yamamoto's death, there is a real air of finality to this, that the Gotei 13 will never be the same again. As Yhwach just annihilates Yamamoto's body in a flurry of explosions. The very same captains react to his death here as they did in the original chapter before Yhwach orders the complete and utter destruction of Soul Society. And I'm just so glad that they kept this as intact as they could, because it is a vitally important moment, and I think that dropping down to 4 chapters for this episode just did wonders for this sort of thing, and we'll actually see at least 2 more examples in the rest of this review where they were able to allow a scene to really breathe and give it the time it deserved. They didn't have to cut any lines of dialogue from it, and I think that is vitally important, like I said, to the success of this episode as a whole, but also to the success of the end of the first invasion. Robert, Bambietta, and Mask are the 3 Sternritter we get to see actually summon the Soldat into battle. This is the same as it is in the original chapter, except there, while we know it's these 3 Sternritter doing it, the only one whose perspective we actually get to see is Robert. But here we get to see all 3 of them actually summon them in, which is really cool. I will take any extra Sternritter screen time that I can get. I am very happy with that. I love Mask's like crazed grin on his face as he knows that he is basically bringing in Seireite's doom from above. It is a little bit strange that some small details are not being adhered to where it doesn't seem like there's any reason for them not to be. For instance, when Robert activates the shadow and kind of swings it upwards into the sky, it's supposed to burst open and take the form of a Quincy cross. That's pretty obvious to me, and yet for some reason it doesn't do that here in the anime. It's just a kind of blob, a mass of shadow in the sky. It's a tiny detail, but it's one of those details where I look at it and I'm like, why was that changed? It doesn't feel like there was any reason for it. But I have to say that I think the Soldat's arrival is just handled so well. It's slower, more methodical here than it is in the original chapter. It's more drawn out. We get to see them kind of melting out of the darkness. It feels creepy, it feels eerie. They all drop to the ground. We get this fantastic close-up of Robert's face as he orders them to advance. Easily the best Robert has been drawn in this new anime so far. But this next moment, as the Soldat arrive, is slightly different to how it appears in the original chapter. The Shinigami that we see in the anime in this moment are these 2 Shinigami appearing on screen right now, who also initially react to the Soldat's arrival. However, it's a bit of a shame that they kind of change this next moment, because a familiar face is supposed to show up here, only to be killed. Toshimori Umesada from way back in the Soul Society arc. This is the guy who accosts Uryu and Orihime, and while not a major character, it was nice seeing him here trying to stand his ground, only to be killed by the Soldat. Unfortunately, he's removed from this scene entirely, and it's just these Shinigami getting that same treatment. But we are then treated to an amazing extended sequence as the Soldat just charge headfirst into the Soul Society. We see them stampeding towards the Shinigami, butchering them all as they go, killing everyone in their wake. We get these lovely aerial shots, seeing the white cloaks of the Soldat advancing through the streets of Seireite, explosions going off all around them. I honestly thought this scene was really well executed, and it really got across just how bad the situation had finally become, how the situation had basically become unsalvageable. It's just really effective seeing these squads of highly trained troops mowing down wave after wave of clearly very unprepared Shinigami. The Seireite has never looked this bad. It has never looked in this bad shape, and I think this is the moment where the anime truly captures that sense of desperation that the first invasion actually really thrives on. Small details too, like seeing a group of Shinigami just impaled by a wave of Quincy arrows is lovely to see. That's all brand new stuff. The Soldat's actual invasion in the original chapter barely constitutes about a page and a half. We then see a Shinigami getting his neck broken underneath Basby's boot, revealing, of course, Basby is still alive. That's exactly the same as it appears in the chapter. Yhwach stands surveying the damage as Soul Society is being razed to the ground. However, his line about waiting for the Zero Division to emerge is actually cut here. We then transition to the opening of chapter 512, where we see Ichigo still locked in Kirige's jail, jail, sensing the deaths of everyone across the Seirete, and the actual cliffhanger moment of 511 is removed from this episode, where that explosion goes off in the air and Yhwach turns to look at it. But Ichigo himself gets a nice, slightly extended scene here in the Garganta where he's crying out for the Shinigami to try and survive, for them not to disappear, and when the Garganta does finally smash, when it is shattered open, we see Akon standing there, injured, daggers in his back, as he is pleased to see Ichigo, but barely holding on. Akon's line to Ichigo is slightly different here. In the original chapter, he says that opening the Garganta was a little trickier than he had expected, but in the anime, he says that things never quite go the way you want them to. And I have to say, I just love both of these lines. I love Akon, and it's really cool seeing him get the respect he deserves. I love seeing this scene is basically totally untouched, and actually any changes they do make, I really quite like. It's interesting, they're not so much changes as they are just really interesting execution. We see Akon collapse to the ground, like I said, with these Quincy daggers in his back, but Ichigo looks down at him, and we get to experience this whole next scene from the first-person viewpoint of Ichigo himself, which I think is a really excellent idea. It is kind of handled this way in the original chapter as well, but it's just much clearer here. Of course, standing outside the terminal is Shaz Domino, the mysterious Sternritter who doesn't seem to have a place in this story at all. I'm honestly genuinely surprised that Shaz Domino's scene is left completely untouched. I expected he would be here, but I thought they might amend it a little bit to help it line up with what we know about Shaz later on, which of course is that he isn't a real Sternritter in the sense that he is actually just a creation of another Sternritter. I kind of thought they might allude to that somehow, but the fact that his appearance here is exactly the same as it is in the original chapter makes me wonder if they're just going to leave him like this, therefore leaving him as an anomaly within the anime, or if they have plans to expand upon it later on down the line. But regardless, I love seeing Ichigo just dashing towards him, this really cocky Shaz being like, "Who the hell are you?" only to be smacked in the face with a massive Getsuga Tensho is a wonderful moment and really, really well handled. Actually getting that sensation of motion that you are Ichigo makes that scene work really, really well. Once the Getsuga explodes out of the terminal, we get Yhwach's reaction like before, but it's also accompanied by a bunch of brand new Sternritter reactions. Again, I'm so happy to see this, including Sternritter like Basby and even Meninus. They are really leaning into the fact that they have revealed that Meninus was there, and I'm all for it. This is then immediately followed up by the Shinigami's reaction to Ichigo's arrival, which is from the original chapter. Ichigo emerges from the smoke, except this time he's actually carrying Akon, which I think is a wonderful detail that the anime team didn't need to add, but it's very in character for Ichigo to do this. Despite the blind rage that he is feeling, he would still rescue whoever he can. And I love that he manages to get Akon out of there, put him down on the ground before going to survey the rest of Soul Society. Lovely new detail. As Ichigo surveys the landscape, checking to see if Rukia and Renji are still alive, he then vanishes immediately. We get the same reaction from the same Sternritter, Kangdu, Master Masculine, and Bambietta. And this whole sequence with Ichigo, like I said, I've said many times they had to get it right. And I think they did. They adhered to the most important parts stylistically that they had to. That being, of course, the incredible rainfall, that quiet nature of Ichigo, that uncharacteristically quiet version of him, where you never see his face until right at the very end, and they nailed all of that. All aspects of that moment, they got it exactly right, and I'm so grateful for that. Speaking of moments, I am so grateful for them getting right. Thankfully, Ichigo and Byakuya's conversation, if you can really call it that, it's mostly a monologue from Byakuya's perspective, is left totally intact. Thank you very much. This scene is handled with the respect that it deserves, and I was very happy to see how it played out. Once again, much like Yhwach's speech to the fallen Yamamoto, this is another sequence in this episode that really benefits from the slightly slower pace, from the fact that they have adapted fewer chapters. And I actually wonder if the main reason for adapting fewer chapters in this episode is to keep these emotional beats, these set pieces, as close to the original chapter as possible. I will confess, up until literally the other day, I had no idea that that woman standing by the window was Nanao. That's a really awesome little detail. I just never noticed the vice captain's badge on her arm. I thought it was supposed to be a nondescript Shinigami, perhaps a wife of a soldier who had fallen in battle, but it's Nanao, and I think that's really cool as well, probably sensing that Kyoraku has been taken down. That's an awesome little detail, and you know, you learn something new every day, and it's kind of making me think differently about this scene that I thought I knew so well. But this was a difficult scene to get right, and I think that they crucially nailed it. I think Byakuya's voice actor really brings it in this scene, bringing that sense of hopelessness, bringing that sense of despair to his voice, that quiet injury, that sadness, that mournfulness to Byakuya as he thinks he's basically giving his last words to Ichigo. It's beautifully handled. I think they did such a great job with it. Byakuya, of course, looking completely blood-soaked and near death as he is just standing unable to move inside this crater within the wall. It's such a beautiful moment between two characters who were once enemies. And now we get to this point, and it's so amazing that Byakuya's development comes so full circle like this. Now, while they don't adapt the end of this conversation exactly the same, which I've always imagined to be a bolt of lightning illuminating Ichigo's completely just enraged face, they actually do their own unique spin on this moment I think works really well. Of course, the idea here is that Ichigo is barely able to utter even a few words to Byakuya because the anger is seething, boiling, and bubbling up inside him until it reaches breaking point. And I think they convey that really well here. The rainfall as it reaches Ichigo begins to evaporate. That heat is suddenly coming off of his body as the power is building and burning inside like a raging furnace. Ichigo is ready to go, ready to rain hellfire down on these enemies. And I think it does work really nicely. Seeing that rain completely evaporate around him as his Reiatsu begins to swirl, and you get that stone cold, merciless expression on his face. The cliffhanger of 512 with Ichigo flinging Tensa Zangetsu down at Yhwach's feet, preventing him from leaving, is exactly the same here as it is in that original chapter, just with an extra panel of Ichigo's face looking completely deranged and ready for battle. The next part of the episode is the beginning of chapter 513, and again is thankfully left near untouched, as we get Byakuya talking to himself, thinking to himself about Ichigo leaving, not giving him any response. But because Byakuya knows this boy so well at this point, he doesn't need a response. He knows that no matter what, Ichigo will do everything he can to protect those he cares about. It's really cool getting that tiny extra shot of Ichigo leaving Byakuya's viewpoint as Byakuya's eyes can barely focus. It's almost like, was Ichigo even there? You know, maybe Byakuya was just imagining the arrival of Soul Society's saviour, but of course Ichigo was there, and I just love that he turns without a word and vanishes, almost as though he can't bear to look at what's happened to Byakuya any longer without completely losing himself to rage. Fantastically well done. As Byakuya looks up to the sky, he leaves everything up to Ichigo before dropping his blade, and it shatters almost completely. I'm going to be really interested to see the reception to the next episode from anime-only viewers. We know, of course, that Byakuya doesn't die here, no matter how telegraphed it may seem. The absolute shattering of his Zanpakuto toe really should indicate that he is basically about to die, like literally about to die, but somehow he survives it regardless and would eventually return to his normal captain duties. There is a 0% chance that they actually kill Byakuya off, so I think they're going to play out this character's fate in exactly the same way as it happens in the original material. I think they mitigated the idea of Byakuya dying somewhat a few episodes ago by removing Hashwolf's line about his death, removing some of the gore from that scene, not showing his rib cage, for example. But then you go back to this scene, it really looks like he has died once more. That dropping of the Zanpakuto toe, the way it breaks into pieces, it really feels like they are hammering it home. But again, it could just be that you are supposed to be witnessing this character's actual fall, an actual defeat of Byakuya. But then he himself even says that he doesn't have much time left, so it's always going to be a contentious moment, I think. But regardless, I love that they employed the silence here at the end, like I was really hoping they would. Ichigo confronting Yhwach here and yelling at him, asking if he is the one who devastated Soul Society like this, is basically the exact same as it appears in the source material, though I will say I do think Ichigo looks a lot better in the original chapter in this moment than he does here in the episode. But there's no denying how palpable Ichigo's rage is when he begins to exert his bubbling crimson Reiatsu that just tears through the land. He looks demonic at times, which I just think is so awesome to see, when the shadow comes across his face but his eyes flash a pearly red. I love it. I think it looks so very good, and it just really effectively gets across how angry this guy actually is, and I love that. It helps the emotion, it heightens the emotion, and it really makes you feel like Ichigo is bearing the weight of all these deaths on his shoulder. Like he knows that he is too late, but he's going to do something about it regardless. As Ichigo's power burns this hellish crimson, Yhwach decides that he will crush Ichigo himself, as he's not really being given any other choice. But then what we get here, I really wasn't expecting. We get a lovely extended battle sequence, which looks fantastic. I am so happy. When this started, I was like, I can't believe it. I was like, this is so awesome to see. I really didn't expect to get a super fluid, super fast battle scene between these two characters. While it is short, it's A, longer than it is in the original chapter, and B, more fitting, I think, for the first confrontation between Ichigo and the main villain of this arc. They come together, locking blades as Reiatsu just kind of ripples off of them in this massive blinding effect, and then they begin darting, blitzing through the Soul Society, moving at such imperceptible speeds, and the music is blaring and it is brilliant. The track that's playing, whatever it's called, when Ichigo is battling Yhwach in the air here, is my favourite new track released so far. It's been played a couple of other times as well. I just think it's so awesome. As they clash in midair, golden sparks flying as their blades are locked in fierce combat. One thing I like is that you can tell Ichigo is giving it his all, but he's almost clumsily throwing himself into battle because he is so consumed by anger and a desire to just completely destroy this guy, whereas Yhwach is putting up a fight, but you can tell he's also not even really having to try that hard. The main takeaway for me, however, is that I just wasn't expecting this. And if they're able to continue to consistently deliver moments like this even after last week's episode that was already so impressive, then we are in for one hell of an adaptation for the rest of the 1,000-Year Blood War. But this entire mid-air duel is brand new, ending with Ichigo being flung to the ground, smashing into the floor as Yhwach lands beside Hashwolf. From beneath the rubble, Ichigo launches a Getsuga Tensho at the Quincy King, and this is where we now pick up from where we left off in the chapter itself. From the dust, Yhwach reaches out, grabs Ichigo, his hand looking absolutely massive as he grapples with the boy, pinning him to the ground. Ichigo, in an almost feral rage, attempts to swipe at Yhwach's face, only to have his hand batted away before Yhwach stabs him in the throat. I'm not entirely sure why Yhwach thought Ichigo would survive that stab. I mean, he does, but he wants him to survive it anyway. He sort of feels his pulse, and he's like, he should still be alive, let's take him back to the castle. Seemed a little bit risky, if you asked me. While this is all the same as it appears in the original chapter, these events have always perplexed me somewhat. Yhwach mentions taking Ichigo back to the castle to re-educate him and put him under their command. But how exactly were they going to do this? Literally through simple indoctrination, I'm wondering? I don't think they're talking about any kind of spell or anything like that. I think he literally just wants to, as we find out a little bit later, sit Ichigo down, tell him the truth about his heritage, and hope that it would change Ichigo's perspective on the war. But I'm also wondering, why does Hashwolf look so despondent about this whole situation? These plot points are never really revisited again in the original story, so I wonder if they will be here. Anyway, as Ichigo is instinctively revealed to have blocked Yhwach's blade with Blute, he unleashes a point-blank Getsuga Tensho, and that is the end of chapter 513. At the start of 514, where Yhwach emerges from the blast, it always always kind of looked to me like he sort of waved it away, like eventually, after being hit by it a little bit, he just batted the energy aside. But here in the anime, again, that wonderful track playing up as Haschwalth cries out for Yhwach, it looks to me like Yhwach is using some kind of actual ability to dispel the energy. Kind of looks a little bit like Blutvein and Haben, although I don't think it quite is. But regardless, it's a really awesome moment. But this is what I loved about Yhwach at the start of this arc. He was getting in, getting his hands dirty, getting injured early on, and even admitting when he had made a mistake. Yhwach's revelation to Ichigo about him having Quincy Reiatsu inside of him, including a hint being dropped as to where it comes from regarding you don't know anything about your own mother, is again basically totally identical to the source material, and is my final example of this episode adapting fewer chapters being beneficial to these big, important beats within them. Like, it really feels like the anime team understood the gravity of this moment, of this conversation, and knew that they had to have it in with all the lines intact. There's great shots of Ichigo freaking out. The moments where Yhwach says that he will forcibly drag Ichigo back to the Wandenreich are all the same as they appear in the chapter. We get again this notion of Yhwach re-educating Ichigo, which makes me think that he really does just mean sitting him down and telling him the truth about the Quincy and his heritage and all that sort of thing. But of course, that would never come to be because Ichigo is having none of it. And yet, right before the end of the episode, we're treated to another brand new scene. Another fantastic additional sequence where Yhwach calls down a brand new ability with which to attack Ichigo. Yhwach's brand new ability is called Qualkreis, which through my very limited knowledge, i.e. trying to use Google Translate, I believe is German for something like agony circle, which to me makes perfect sense as these bars of blue light are encircling Ichigo and then proceeding to attack him, but anyone who is considerably more knowledgeable about German than me, please do let me know in the comments below what this actually means. But yeah, Ichigo is just surrounded by this cage of blue light, and these bars then begin reforming into bows and blasting Ichigo with arrows one after the other. It's really cool seeing just how strong and capable Ichigo actually is here. However, he spins around deflecting one of the arrows, then launches again a massive Getsuga Tensho, severing a number of these bars. Every single Getsuga Tensho that Ichigo has done so far in the 1,000-Year Blood War has looked a spectacle, and I really hope they keep that up, because it kind of gives you the impression that Ichigo really is so immensely powerful. Even if Getsuga is basically all he can do, you better believe that every time he does it, it will be a showstopper. However, Yhwach's Qualkreis then begins to connect its arrows to massive chunks of debris before firing those at Ichigo instead, crushing him in the midst of this mound of rubble. It's cool though, you get to see Ichigo's Blut acting up again, covering his face to defend him from the worst of the damage, but he does still collapse to the floor. So this entire sequence with Yhwach's new ability replaces a small sequence in the original chapter where Yhwach just kind of rushes Ichigo, locks blades with him, but uses his sword to swat Ichigo's sword up into the air before grabbing Ichigo by the head. Here, with Ichigo now on the ground, Yhwach simply walks over to him and grabs him in the same way. This next sequence, however, where Yhwach is ensnared suddenly by the shadows and Haschwalth says that they have to return as they've run out of time, is the same as it appears in the original chapter, and again, I'm a little bit surprised by that, because again, these are plot points that were never revisited. And I do kind of wonder if the anime will expand on this idea why Yhwach couldn't remain outside of the shadows for this particular period of time. Again, we get more extra Sternritter shots, which I'm so happy about. We get to see a number of them using the Quincy shadow to leave the Seirete as the first invasion comes to an end. I love getting these different individual shots of the characters leaving. Bambietta, Master Masculine, Kangdu. My favourite shot is probably Robert leaving the defeated Kyoraku just lying on the floor, this gaping wound in his chest where he was shot. That's really awesome to see. It's cool to get a really good view of how the shadow actually works. It's like the Quincy's own shadow kind of slides off of their body before creating a doorway next to them. Really awesome stuff. And again, I love that creepy sound the shadow makes, that sort of as it appears. Really cool. It is a shame that Az was defeated already. It would have been cool to see him leaving alongside the rest of these Quincy. But again, it's awesome that we even get to see Meninas leaving, and she even says more lines to Rukia. What is a big shame, however, is that there is no reveal here of who was fighting Ukitake, which does feel like a missed opportunity. But the church bells that play over the Wandenreich's retreat are so effective at creating this almost funereal scene as the Soul Society just kind of lies in ruins, and these creepy ghost-like enemies just melt back into the darkness to disappear to who knows where, and you've no idea when they might attack again, but it just leaves the Soul Society with this feeling of death lingering in the air. The church bells are like the cherry on top that really make it feel like a funeral procession has begun for the Soul Society itself. It's all absolutely excellent, and really just the atmosphere is perfect here. But it's not over yet, as a furious and tenacious Ichigo rushes Yhwach, trying to stab him before he can escape. But of course, Yugrim Hashwoth spins round and instantly cuts Tensa Zangetsu in half. I love how dramatic this is. I love seeing the blades spiral into the sky and then that dramatic final shot of it landing in the floor. It's so well done. It just all looks absolutely fantastic. Hashwoth sheaths his blade in silence before following his master into the darkness, into the abyss. It's really fantastic. Of course, Yhwach leaves Ichigo with those final words, "My son, born in the dark," as the shadow closes around the Quincy King. And we end the episode with the cliffhanger of 514, leaving a bewildered Ichigo to only look on as the enemy managed to successfully escape, and a chapter-accurate title card as Born in the Dark appears on screen. And with that, the first invasion is officially over, and I do feel like this was a near-perfect episode. Like I said, the pacing felt right. It meant that they could give the moments that needed a chance to breathe the chance they deserved, the time they deserved, while treating us to brand new stuff that I absolutely wasn't expecting. Whether that's the extended fight between Ichigo and Yhwach, whether that's the addition of Yhwach's new power, Qualkreis, or of course, the amazing introduction that's all brand new material. I was extremely happy with all of it. So then, moving on, we have a somewhat awkward Sternritter In Memoriam to look at. I don't really know whether or not to put Shaz Domino on here. I'm going to add him on here for now, because if they carry on with the same trajectory as the original chapters, the original source material, he will never show up again. And as far as I'm concerned, he is as good as dead. However, if they do decide to adapt the supplementary story that he appears in, we will remove Shaz once again from our In Memoriam list. But yeah, that is the episode, another total winner. Now we're treated to a brand new ending sequence this week. The song is the same, but the visuals are totally new, depicting, of course, those original captains of the Gotei 13. I'm going to talk about this ending in a separate video coming later this week. This video's already been running for far too long as it is, but a lot of people have pointed out that it looks like the captains appear in this ending in the order of which division they are a member of, and that's what we're going to talk about in this follow-up video. I'm going to dive into that theory in a bit more detail. But for now, I just want to say that I do think this new ending looks beautiful, and I kind of hope they just keep this now for the rest of this first season. I think it really does look great, and it's so cool getting to see the original Gotei 13 with these almost full body, or at least expanded, shots. Our preview poem for next week's episode seems to feature Kukaku Shiba, and it makes a lot of sense with the content of next week's episode, which we'll get into in a sec with our predictions, as well as the title of next week's episode, which of course is the Shooting Star Project Zero Mix. But But Kukaku's poem is both nice and fairly simple, I think, and the poem simply reads, "I look to the heavens and chase that star, burned into my eyes, the afterglow of its smoke." As far as I'm concerned, this seems to be referencing Kukaku's flower crane cannon, and the ritual needed to ignite the cannon as well, watching as whatever is fired from it reaches the heavens like a falling star, while Kukaku herself, the master of the cannon, is left behind, only to watch the glow of the smoke. So if we end this review like we do each week, with some predictions for next week's episode 8, it's gonna be a big one as far as I'm concerned. The action, now that the first invasion is over, will subside for now and will instead be replaced with lots of dialogue and some amazing character interactions. Honestly, there are a few potential cliffhangers they could have here. Either the ending of 518, 519, or 520 would all work really well. Personally though, what I think is most likely is they will end with the final scene of 519, Hot Hot Heat, with of course the reveal of none other than the Soul King himself. That does seem like a great way to end the episode, while saving the Unohana reveal of 520 for the start of episode 9, which could be almost an entirely Unohana-themed episode. Of course, what I'm looking forward to most next week, and I imagine is the same for a lot of people, is the much-anticipated arrival of the Zero Division. I genuinely can't wait to see these characters animated and brought to life. I'm really very excited for that. I do wonder if they will keep these early Zero Division scenes exactly the same or not. There's an awful lot of comedy here, almost unexpected comedy, and the anime so far has been cutting back on a lot of comedic stuff, so I can't help but wonder if it's all going to be left untouched. Of course, if they decided to stick with what I said earlier is the sweet spot for the amount of chapters being adapted per episode, it means that episode 8 will actually end on the cliffhanger of 518, with Ichigo arriving in the royal palace, which I also think would work remarkably well, as it then means that episode 9 could be devoted almost entirely to the early antics of the royal palace, and then episode 10 can be a full episode dedicated to Unohana versus Kenpachi. Honestly, I actually think this would work really, really well, ending episode 9 with the cliffhanger from 523 where Unohana and Zaraki clash blades and begin their fight. Honestly, that works perfect for me, and it means we would stick with this ideal number of chapters being adapted, but you can never say for sure how many they're going to do. There are massive moments to be had next week for sure. We will of course get the pivotal story reveal that a broken bankai can never be returned, can never be made whole again, essentially, which of course is the driving factor behind Ichigo going to the royal palace in the first place. We'll get a number of characters making their return next week. Kon will make his return, but again, since they're cutting back dramatically on comedic moments, I think we'll see Kon, but I just think his scene will probably be cut down. Other characters include, of course, the return of the Fullbringers, or some of them at least anyway, Ginjo, Gideko, and Tsukishima, which I'm really excited for, as well as more overt teases about Grimjo's return. Chapter 518 was absolutely crazy back in the day. People were so excited that week. That chapter review on my channel was one of the earliest videos to do even remotely well for me. And it's because people were so excited by the craziness that was unfolding in that single chapter. So many old characters suddenly made their return. A couple of things were just blasted through in the original chapters. For example, the launching of the flower crane cannon, the ritual that goes around it, that was basically all scrapped entirely. Kukaku is only really in it for like a page, so I can't help but wonder if those are moments that are ripe for some slight extensions. But that's it for this in-depth spoiler review and discussion of episode 7 of the 1,000 Year Blood War, titled Born in the Dark. As you can probably tell, I really did love it. I thought it was excellent, and I can breathe a sigh of relief that I think the first Quincy invasion was handled pretty well overall. There are a couple of things I would change, a few pacing things I would change, certainly earlier on around episode 3 or whatnot, but for the most part, very, very happy. Let me know in the comments below, guys, what you thought of episode 7. I really do want to hear your thoughts and opinions and your feelings on how this episode played out, and also your predictions for next week's episode as well. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and stay tuned for that video on the original Gotei 13 and their potential division placements coming soon later this week. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.